Absolutely loving this still. Ash just fell off on its own, still burning nice and even. Flavor is all there, not disappointed. Like I said, if I were to compare this with the Cohiba Talisman, again, my own personal preference, my own palate, I'm going to take this every day over that. Really, really liking the flavors of this and thoroughly enjoying this. But again, I want to keep talking about Paul and his transformation that occurred on the road to Damascus. Now, this would have sent shockwaves up and down. I mean, think about this for a second. His former allies are now his enemies, and his enemies are probably still his enemies. So the guy's caught between a rock and a hard place with potential enemies on both sides. And it would have been very difficult to see how the early Christians would have given him any type of warm reception. I mean, it was actually even written, "Isn't this the man that raised havoc in Jerusalem, that persecuted those that called on the name of Jesus?" I mean, there was a lot of animosity towards Saul, and rightfully so because of what he did. And they could have easily believed, hey, this guy is setting some type of trap to try and infiltrate us, capture our leaders, and really just try and put a kibosh on this whole thing. But that was far from the truth, because Saul began to minister in a lot of the local synagogues to both Jews and Gentiles, proclaiming that this Jesus fellow had risen from the dead. I mean, just an absolutely crazy message to a lot of people. But this is what he was preaching. He was teaching that he was the Son of God. Now, Son of the God was not something that was unique or started by the early church. In fact, this was something that was started by the Romans. The emperor, or emperor was another name for the conquering general, or they were known as the Pontificus Maximus, the high priest, but they were also known as the Son of God. And this was kind of the fact that the Caesars ruled and reigned as supreme power over everyone else. This is what they believed. And the Christians really drew a sharp contrast with them when they called Jesus the Son of God. And you could see how that would cause some problems with certain individuals. But it wasn't long after Saul was ministering when he would sort of get a taste of his own medicine. Sadly, on one of his first missionary journeys, as he was proselytizing to other people, he was met with favor by some individuals, but he was also met with a lot of animosity. And it was in Lystra that he was winning over individuals when suddenly the Jews got a whole bunch of people to side with him, and they stoned him. Man, what a horrible way to die potentially. Well, Saul was stoned and left for dead just outside the city, but he was actually alive. And some of his disciples grabbed him and they carried him off to safety. But later on another missionary journey, when he was with one of his individuals that worked closely with him by the name of Silas, they were both imprisoned in a jail in Philippi. But Saul had all sorts of problems and a lot of difficulties throughout his journeys. He actually documents that 3 times he was shipwrecked. He spent a night and day at sea. He was stoned, he was beaten with rods, he was without sleep, without food. I mean, you gotta ask yourself, why was this guy doing this? What, he could have retired or lived in Jerusalem as a great Pharisee and been just fine. But he's going out and he's doing all this stuff. The question that boggles scholars and historians is why? But there was another problem that was looming on the horizon for Paul in this young, fledgling faith. And that was when he was in the city of Corinth. He had spent about 1.5 years here when he faced some very fierce opposition from the Jewish people in the community there. Let me have another little puff here. That smoke output is fantastic. Anyways, some of the charges that were leveled against him was that this guy is teaching things that are contradictory to the laws of their religion. And Paul wasn't teaching anything illegal or wrong. The only thing that he was doing that was really making them mad is he was winning over both Jews and Gentiles, and these people didn't like that. And it wasn't long after there were some charges that were trumped up and brought against him that Paul would stand before the proconsul of Achaia, Lucius Junius Gallio, who was the proconsul of Achaia, like I said, which was all of Greece in the year 51 AD. We know this from Roman records as well as with the biblical accounts. So they synergize perfectly. But the reason that this trial was so significant is because if Paul was found guilty, he would almost surely be imprisoned, or worse yet, he would be killed. Now, Paul was a Roman citizen, but just because you were a Roman citizen didn't mean that they wouldn't put you to death. They would just do it in a more dignified manner, to say the least. Instead of crucifying you on a cross, like Jesus was, the most humiliating, worst way to die in antiquity, they would simply decapitate you if you were a Roman citizen and you were guilty of something worthy of that. So we're going to talk a little bit about the trial in just a minute. I want to get down a little bit further on this, just kind of see how this keeps going. And we'll talk about Paul's trial and how important it was when he stood before Lucius Junius Gallio. Definitely a cigar that is worthy of smoking it right down to the nub. I don't usually get that far. I won't go that far probably, but man, we might run out of a cigar before we're done talking about Paul and what happened. The guy was now about to stand before Lucius Junius Gallio, the most powerful man that Paul could stand before at the time. And I've been to Corinth many times, ancient Corinth, and in the center of the city there's an agora, which was kind of the marketplace with a huge opening where people would gather together, and there was a very large marble platform that stood up. And this is where the proconsul, whoever was in charge at the time, would pronounce judgment, innocent or guilty. And it was also known as the bema seat, where, like I said, the judgments took place. But as the prosecution brought their evidence that they gathered against Paul, and then his teachings of telling people to worship God contrary to their laws and this and that, and a lot of lies and trumped up charges, like I said, they presented their case. And then it was Paul's turn to give his defense. And just as he was about to speak, Gallio stands up, motions with his hands, stopping Paul from speaking. And he says, you know what, if this was a serious crime of villainy, I'd be justified in accepting the complaint of you Jews. But he said, this is a matter of religious indifference amongst yourselves. And I'm not going to judge Paul on this. If he wants to do this and worship this way, so be it. This was amazing for Paul. It wasn't like the case with Jesus and Pontius Pilate, where Pilate said he was guilty of sedition. Gallio essentially legalized Christianity, that it could be taught, that it could be preached, and Paul could do what he wanted. He threw it out of court. What a victory for Paul and his people. Had he been stopped here, like I said, Paul probably would have been imprisoned, the movement would have stopped, he wouldn't have been able to go further with his mission, and it would have been a whole different world that we potentially live in based on this one decision of Gallio. Now, anyone that knows or loves Roman history knows who Lucius Junius Gallio is. His brother was the greatest Stoic philosopher of the day, Aeneas Seneca, who was the tutor of, you guessed it, none other than Nero. Nero was emperor during this time, and Seneca was his tutor, but Seneca was a good man, at least moralistically speaking. He was basically in control for about the first 5 years of Nero's reign, and they were said to be, by Tacitus, the best years of the Roman Empire. Now, one might ask, why are their names different, Seneca and Gallio? Well, Gallio was adopted by a wealthy friend of the Senecas. And something that the Romans did a little bit different than us moderns do is they didn't adopt babies. The Romans would have looked at us cross-eyed and said, why in the world would you adopt a baby? You don't know what he's going to be like. You know, at least if we adopt an adult, we can see he's handsome, he's smart, he's intelligent. We'll go with that route. And that's what they did. They adopted Gallio, and his name was changed because of that. Now, I want to jump a little bit ahead in Paul's ministry because, my goodness, we're going to run out of Cigar here pretty soon. But I want to stick with our narrative with Gallio and Seneca because I think there's a very interesting correlation that's going on here later on in Paul's mission. And I was going to take a break here, but I want to keep plugging along with this, with the Gallio-Seneca narrative. Several years later, after Paul had left Corinth, he was arrested again in Jerusalem and he was brought to Caesarea Maritima, where he would spend several years there. And he had stated in one of the letters that he wrote while he was in Corinth to the church in Rome that he was going to visit them, or that it was his plan to visit them, because he wanted to take his message to the ends of the earth, which to them, the known end of the earth, was Spain or Gaul, France, all those areas. Excuse me, I'm going to grab a quick drink here. But he wanted to bring his message to those people in the far, far west, and he wanted to make Rome his base of operations. Now, after he was arrested, and he was in Caesarea Maritima for several years, he went through several different courts to try and be freed, and it didn't happen. He went through Felix, he went through Festus and Agrippa. And finally, being a Roman citizen, what Paul was able to do was he was able to appeal to the Supreme Court, much like we do today because of his citizenship. And he said, I want to stand before Nero. Now think about this for a second. If Paul appeals to Nero, he's got a free trip to Rome. And if Seneca is running the country, and him and Gallio are brothers, and they have very close connections, they talk back and forth all the time, well, Seneca's probably going to do the same thing that Gallio did. He's going to throw the case out of court. Paul's going to be free, and he's going to be able to take his message further west. Well, he got his wish, and he was sent there, but we don't know for certain if Paul ever stood before Nero. Now, by this time, Nero had also turned into an absolute monster. He'd already killed his mother Agrippina. He would later kill both Seneca and Gallio, making them both commit suicide because he was just such a monster. But Paul definitely, almost certainly, I think there's a good consensus of scholars that believe he stood before Nero and he was set free. Now, what happened to Paul after he was freed, I want to talk about in just a minute. We're going to bring this down a little bit further. In fact, I'm going to take off the wrapper. That came off very nice, that Royal, beautiful cigar. But we're going to talk about what happened to Paul after he went west. What do we know after that? Because the Bible doesn't tell us if Paul did any of these things or what actually happened to him. I'll be right back. Well, without wasting any more time, did Paul make it to Rome? Yes, he did. But he waited almost 2 years to be tried by Nero. And again, like I said, the Bible doesn't talk about any of this. The New Testament documents are completely silent on this. In fact, Acts of the Apostles has a rather weird ending that just basically states that Paul did in fact make it to Rome. But like I said, Paul waited 2 years for his trial, and this was likely because around this time is when Nero had killed his mother Agrippina, and he was afraid to go back into Rome, so he just sort of circled around the outskirts of Rome for almost 2 years. This would have created a pretty strong backlog of cases that he had to deal with. And like I said, there's a general consensus consensus among a lot of historians that Paul did stand before him, that he was released by Nero, and he was free to go. We know this based on one piece of evidence. A writer by the name of Clement of Rome in the year 96 AD said that Paul reached the limits of the West, which would imply that he made it to Spain and that he, shared the gospel there. But by the time the years around 66 to 67, Paul's life and he was in imminent danger. There's no doubt about this by this time, because in 64 AD, that was when the Great Fire of Rome took place. Nero had shifted the blame onto the Christians, and there were bullseyes on their back. Paul, being the ringleader of these people, had an enormous target on his back, and he was actually captured and imprisoned based on some sources that we have. And these are good sources, I might add you. Almost every ancient historian is in consensus and agreement that Paul was captured, and after he was captured, he was brought outside the city gates on the Ostian Way in Rome, or the Ostian Gate, and he was to be beheaded because of his crimes against Rome and him being a Christian. And again, like I said, being a Roman citizen, he would not be relegated to crucifixion. He would be spared of that. And yeah, the church fathers tell us that when he was brought outside the gate, the steel blade came down, severed his head right from his body, and he was buried nearby there. And to this day, there's a church that has been erected there, and Paul's sarcophagus is housed there. It's very interesting. I've been there multiple times. You can walk right up to the Apostle Paul's grave, and on a stone slab, written in large Latin uncials, all capital letters, it says, Paul, Apostle and Martyr. This is where Paul's message ended in Rome. And he was one of the greatest, well, he's not one of, he was the greatest missionary in the church's history. He was the greatest theologian in the church's history. Paul universalized the message of Jesus of Nazareth. He proliferated this throughout the ends of the earth, and to this day, it is still spreading and it is still alive and well. But something that has always puzzled scholars and theologians is why? Why did this happen? How did the early church movement begin? Because if you think about it, there were lots of little messianic movements that started, from the first century AD to the second century. And the Romans would put these little insurrections out by killing the messianic leader. And when the messianic leader was killed, it ended. Or they would go get the brother of whoever it was. But this one was different. These individuals said, yeah, you killed our leader, but he rose from the grave and he's alive today. And it's hard to believe that particularly the witnesses, those who knew Jesus personally, would die for something they knew to be a lie. People will always die for something they believe in, but to believe in a lie and to be willing to die for it, that doesn't make sense. People don't do that. Normal people don't do that. And the disciples did that, and Paul did that as well. He went to his grave saying that Jesus really rose from the dead, and he had an encounter, and he met him personally. So this messianic movement, like I said, has endured the test of time, and Saul of Tarsus is almost solely responsible for making this message go to the ends of the earth. And it's a very interesting story. Like I said, whether or not you're religious doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. It's an amazing story. Some people say it's the greatest story ever told. Well, I would say that it's the greatest story that ever could be told. I'll see you next time.